snowstorm came without warning, its howling winds blanketing the mountainside in a suffocating sheet of white. Mark, Sarah, and their two friends had been hiking for hours when the blizzard struck, forcing them off the trail. Desperation set in as the temperature plummeted and nightfall loomed. Just as they began to lose hope, Sarah spotted the faint outline of a lodge nestled among the snow-laden pines. Its windows glowed dimly, a beacon of warmth and refuge in the freezing wilderness. Without a second thought, they made their way to the creaking front door, unaware of the secrets that waited inside. The door groaned as they pushed it open, revealing an interior that felt strangely untouched by time. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Dust-covered furniture stood perfectly arranged, as though someone had just stepped out moments ago. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Mark called out, but his voice seemed to vanish into the heavy silence. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as her eyes landed on a faded painting above the fireplace, a portrait of a man with piercing eyes that seemed to follow her wherever she moved. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but the warmth of the fire was too inviting to ignore. They decided to stay, hoping the storm would pass by morning. As the storm raged on outside, the group began to explore the lodge. Sarah ran her fingers over a dusty bookshelf lined with old leather-bound journals. She pulled one free, its spine cracking as she opened it. "These are dated over 50 years ago," she murmured. The entries described the lodge as a haven for travelers, run by a man named Elijah Frost. But as Sarah flipped further, the tone of the journal shifted. The last entry read, "They never leave. They are mine now. The lodge keeps them warm forever." A loud thud echoed from upstairs, making everyone jump. Mark grabbed a poker from the fireplace as they stared at the staircase. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, though his trembling hands said otherwise. Unable to shake their unease, the group decided to stick together as they climbed the staircase. Each step creaked beneath their weight, the sound swallowed by the storm outside. At the top they found a long hallway lined with doors, most of them ajar. A draft carried the faint scent of decay, making Sarah gag. "Let's check the rooms quickly and get back downstairs," Mark said, his grip tightening on the fire poker. They hesitated at the first door, but when they pushed it open, the room was empty except for a single rocking chair. It swayed back and forth as if someone had just stood up. Sarah stepped closer, noticing a scarf draped over the back of the chair. It was frozen solid, brittle with frost. "This place isn't right," she whispered, her breath visible in the freezing air, though the fire downstairs had been blazing. As they moved down the hallway, the atmosphere grew heavier, the chill sinking deeper into their bones. The second door opened to reveal a bedroom, its bed neatly made with pristine white sheets. On the nightstand sat an old photograph, its glass frame frosted over. Wiping it with her sleeve, Sarah revealed an image of a smiling family. 2 parents and a child. The man in the photo was unmistakably the same as the one in the painting downstairs. "Elijah Frost," she whispered. The others gathered around, their breath fogging the icy glass. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted further, and the light bulb above them flickered before bursting, plunging the room into darkness. A low, guttural whisper filled the silence, so faint it felt like it was inside their heads. "Stay warm." Panic seized the group as they stumbled back into the hallway, their breaths rapid and visible in the freezing air. "This isn't right. We need to leave," Sarah urged, her voice trembling. Mark led the way, but as they reached the stairs, they froze in unison. The staircase was gone, replaced by a wall of rotting wood and frost-covered beams. "What the hell?" Mark muttered, slamming the poker against the wall in vain. A sudden creaking noise drew their attention to the far end of the hallway. The last door, which had been firmly shut moments ago, was now ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond it. A soft, childlike giggle echoed from within. "We're not alone," whispered Jason, his voice barely audible over the sound of the storm raging outside. The giggle sent shivers down their spines, and for a moment no one dared move. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating down the icy hallway. "We have to get out of here now," Sarah shouted, her voice cracking with fear. Mark frantically searched for another way down, his hands running over the frostbitten walls, but every window was sealed shut. the glass frozen solid. Suddenly, the air grew thick with the scent of burning wood, and the temperature spiked unnaturally. They turned toward the hallway to see flames flickering from the gaps between the floorboards, casting eerie, dancing shadows. The fire didn't warm them. Instead, it seemed to sap the heat from their bodies, leaving their fingers and faces numb. The low whisper came again, clearer now. "Stay. You'll be warm forever." A deafening roar of wind suddenly howled through the lodge, rattling the windows as if the storm itself was trying to break in. The fire flickered violently, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. Mark, Sarah, and their friends tried to back away from the flames, but the fire seemed to follow them, its heat growing unbearable, almost suffocating. "We're trapped!" Jason shouted, panic creeping into his voice as he scrambled for any exit. But as he moved toward the back door, it swung open on its own, revealing nothing but a vast sea of white snow, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The wind whipped through the open door, sending icy blasts of cold that felt like sharp needles against their skin. Then, from the darkness outside, a figure appeared, slowly emerging from the snowstorm. A tall, gaunt man dressed in tattered, frozen clothes, his face hidden beneath a hood. As he stepped forward, the snow around his feet began to freeze and crackle. The others froze in place as the figure raised his head, revealing the same piercing eyes from the portrait. His voice, like a distant echo, reached them with chilling clarity. "You're not leaving. This place belongs to me now." The figure stepped closer, his cold eyes locking onto theirs with a gaze that sent waves of dread through the group. The door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside with the man they now recognized as Elijah Frost. His lips curled into a cruel smile as the temperature plummeted even further. The fire in the hearth flickered out, plunging them into complete darkness, save for the faint light filtering through the snow-covered windows. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as Elijah's voice echoed through the now deafening silence. "The storm has no end. It is my prison, and you will join those before you in its cold embrace." The walls seemed to close in around them, the lodge groaning as if it were alive, feeding off their fear. Suddenly, figures began to materialize in the shadows, transparent, frost-covered shapes of past victims, their eyes hollow, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. Each one whispered the same chilling words, "Stay warm, forever." Desperation surged through the group as they realized they were surrounded. The ghosts of Elijah Frost's past victims moved closer, their frozen hands reaching out, their hollow eyes pleading for warmth, for release, though they could never escape. Sarah backed into the wall, her hands trembling as she clutched her jacket tightly around her. "We can't stay here," she whispered, though the words felt useless in the freezing air. Mark's breath came in short, panicked bursts. "There has to be a way out." Elijah Frost stepped forward, his voice as cold and empty as the storm outside. "There is no escape. You are mine now, like all the others who sought shelter from the storm." As his words sank in, the lodge seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The walls shifted, and a new door appeared at the end of the hallway, a door that had never been there before. But this time, the door was different. It was covered in thick, unnatural frost, as if it had been sealed for centuries. Elijah's gaze darkened as he watched them approach. That is the only way out, but at a cost. The door loomed ahead, its frosted surface gleaming in the dim light. The whispers of the trapped souls grew louder, urging them to stay, to embrace the warmth of eternal cold. But the door beckoned, its eerie glow promising a way out, or perhaps an even darker fate. Mark hesitated, his heart racing. "What's behind that door?" he asked, his voice shaking. Elijah Frost's laugh was hollow and cold. "You'll find out soon enough. Those who try to escape the lodge only walk into another prison, but I promise you'll be warm." He stepped back, giving them a chance to make their choice. Sarah, with tears streaming down her face, grabbed Mark's arm. "We can't trust him. We have to go, now." But Jason, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, reached for the door. The instant his hand touched the icy handle, the room plunged into total darkness. A deep, guttural growl echoed from beyond the door, and the temperature dropped to an unbearable level, freezing the very air in their lungs. Suddenly, the door swung open, revealing nothing but an endless void of white snow, an infinite expanse of freezing cold and empty silence. but from the blackness beyond, a pair of glowing eyes gleamed at them, and a voice, old and grating, whispered one last warning. "The lodge never lets you go." The group stood frozen in terror, staring into the endless white void beyond the door, their breaths forming frost in the air. Jason, his hand still on the handle, slowly turned to face the others, his face pale with fear. "It's not real. This can't be real," he muttered, but the gleam in his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. He stepped back from the door, heart racing, but as he did, the temperature plummeted further. The shadows around them began to writhe, and the ghostly figures of the victims reached toward them, their bodies cracking with ice. With a sudden, desperate motion, Sarah grabbed the fire poker and swung it at the door, trying to smash through the ice that had begun to form around the frame. But the poker bounced off with an unnatural force, sending a shock of cold through her body. She screamed as the frost on the walls spread, quickly sealing the door once more. Elijah Frost's voice returned, this time even more commanding. "You can't escape. You've already chosen to stay." As his words echoed through the lodge, the fire in the hearth reignited, but it was no longer warm. It burned cold, feeding the very air with an unrelenting chill. The walls closed in tighter, and the laughter of the lost souls echoed through every corner. As the group realized they were trapped forever, the ghostly figures moved in, wrapping them in their icy embrace. The temperature sank to a bone-chilling low, and in the moments before the darkness fully consumed them, they felt the warmth of their own breath freeze inside their lungs. They were no longer alive, but part of the lodge, warm forever, as the storm outside raged on, waiting for the next travelers to fall, victim to its cold, endless grip. The darkness pressed in, the cold suffocating, but just before the final moment of total silence, Sarah heard a faint whisper, almost drowned by the howl of the storm. "The storm never ends." She turned her head toward the sound, but saw nothing. The icy figures of the previous victims had now completely encased them, their faces frozen in expressions of terror as they too were lost to the eternal cold. Their bodies began to stiffen, eyes wide just like the others trapped before them. Then, in the vast, unending whiteness of the lodge, a new voice rang out. A voice not from the past, but from deep within the lodge itself. It was the voice of the building, of the storm, of everything that had ever sought shelter within its walls. "Welcome to your home, forever." And so, as the snowstorm continued to rage outside, the lodge stood still, its doors forever sealed, awaiting the next weary travelers to fall prey to its icy grip. The frost-bitten souls of the past moved like shadows in the corners, whispering the same chilling warning to anyone who dared approach. The lodge was never empty, for those who sought refuge never truly left, kept warm in the embrace of death, as cold as the storm that would never end. The small town of Winter's Hollow had always been quiet, its residents accustomed to long winters and the weight of the snow that blanketed everything for months. At the edge of town lay an old cemetery, forgotten by most, its headstones weathered and worn with age. The townspeople had long whispered about the strange happenings there, the inexplicable sounds of footsteps in the snow on nights when no one dared to visit, or the flickering lights seen through the trees, far from any house. This winter the cold seemed to bite deeper, and the town felt the grip of something darker than just the seasonal chill. When a local man, digging a grave for the first time in years, unearthed something disturbing in the cemetery, a grave that should have been empty, he began to realize that the dead weren't the only ones buried there. The discovery sent a ripple of unease through the town, but no one dared speak of it openly. The man, Thomas, could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The grave he unearthed had no name, no marker, just a patch of frost-covered earth where the soil had been disturbed long ago. As he stood over the grave, a strange chill filled the air, colder than anything he had felt before. The wind had stopped, and for a brief moment everything was silent. Unnervingly so. Thomas had only been working for a few minutes when he noticed something glinting beneath the frozen dirt. It was a small, ornate key, unlike anything from the modern day. The moment he touched it, the ground around him seemed to tremble, and he heard a faint whisper in the wind. You should not have opened it." Thomas froze, the key still clutched in his hand. The whisper echoed in his ears, though the wind had picked up once more. He tried to shake off the feeling of unease, brushing the frost from the key, but it didn't feel like an ordinary relic. There was something ancient about it, something that didn't belong in the graveyard. Nervously, he returned to town, but the key seemed to weigh heavily in his pocket, its presence gnawing at him. That night, as a heavy snowstorm enveloped Winter's Hollow, the town's power went out, leaving the streets bathed in darkness. The air outside felt thick and unnatural, as if the storm itself was alive. Then, just before midnight, a scream pierced the night, a sound so chilling that it seemed to come from the very ground itself. The townspeople rushed outside, but the scream abruptly stopped, leaving only the howling winds and the eerie silence of the graveyard. The following morning, the town was eerily quiet, the snow deeper than ever. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He decided to return to the cemetery, compelled by a force he couldn't explain. As he approached the gravesite, he was struck by how different the place felt now. The air was thick with tension, and the trees around the cemetery seemed to loom closer, casting long, jagged shadows even in the early light. When he reached the spot where he had unearthed the key, he was horrified to find that the grave had been disturbed again. The dirt around it was freshly disturbed, the earth disturbed as if someone or something had clawed its way out. The frost that had once covered the grave was now gone, and in its place was a patch of wet, black soil. Trembling, Thomas knelt down, his hands shaking as he placed the key in the hole. Suddenly, a low, rumbling growl reverberated through the ground, followed by a scraping sound, as though something was dragging itself beneath the earth. Thomas staggered back, heart racing, as the ground beneath him cracked open, revealing the hollow, dark eyes of a long-dead body, its mouth frozen in a grotesque grin. The body stirred, and Thomas felt a cold hand reach out from the grave, its fingers long and twisted. Thomas stumbled backward, heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The cold hand that had emerged from the grave grasped at the edge of the hole, pulling itself out with unnerving speed. The corpse, now half emerged, was no longer just a decayed body. It was something else. Its skin was stretched tight, an unnatural grey, and its eyes glowed with an eerie, pale light. The chilling grin on its face grew wider as it fully emerged from the grave, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it had not moved in centuries. The key that Thomas had found gleamed faintly in his hand, as if calling to the creature. Without warning, the creature's mouth opened, releasing a low, guttural hiss. "You woke me." The voice was rasping like the sound of cracking ice. It was the voice of something ancient, something that had been buried long before the town was ever founded. Thomas dropped the key in terror, but it didn't matter. The creature reached out, its cold fingers wrapping around his wrist with a force that made him gasp. As the frost began to spread from its touch, the world around him seemed to grow colder, the snow falling harder. The creature leaned in closer, its breath icy against Thomas's face. "Now, you will never leave." Thomas's vision blurred as the cold spread through his body, numbing him to the bone. His pulse thundered in his ears, but his limbs felt heavy, as if the weight of the snow itself was pressing down on him. The creature's grip tightened, and its eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, seemed to pierce straight into his soul. "You have released me, but you will stay, just like the others." The voice echoed inside his head, filling him with a sense of hopelessness. Every part of him screamed to break free, but the freezing grip on his wrist held him fast. The ground around them trembled as more of the frozen corpses began to rise from the graves, their hollow eyes fixed on Thomas, their frozen lips twitching in grotesque smiles. The whispers began again, louder this time, sweeping through the cemetery like a winter wind. "The curse is upon you now. You are one of us." The snow around him began to swirl, thickening until it became impossible to see more than a few feet in front of him. The once quiet cemetery had turned into a place of eternal darkness. The snow fell faster, covering the graves, until they became indistinguishable from the ground itself. As Thomas struggled, he realized there was no escape, no way to run. The creature's grip was now like ice, burning him from within. The air grew so cold that his breath froze before it could leave his mouth, and then, as he lost all feeling in his body, he understood. The graveyard was not just a resting place for the dead, it was a prison that trapped the living just as it had the dead. As Thomas's vision darkened, he felt himself slipping into the cold abyss, his senses fading with every passing second. The frozen hand of the creature released his wrist, and he collapsed to the snow-covered ground, unable to move, unable to scream. The cemetery had become a labyrinth of frost and shadow, the once familiar trees now twisted into menacing shapes, their branches like skeletal arms reaching toward the sky. The whispering voices grew louder, mingling with the wind. You belong to the frost now. He tried to lift his head to look around, but his body was stiff, as if frozen in time. From the corner of his eye he saw something move, another figure emerging from the dark void. It was another soul, one that had been trapped here long ago, its face pale and frozen in a twisted expression of fear. The figure stepped toward him, and Thomas could see the remnants of its once human form. Hollow eyes, skin that had long since turned to brittle ice, and a body covered in frost that had hardened like stone. "Don't fight it," the figure whispered. "You will join us, forever." With those words, it extended its hand to Thomas, and the chill of death seeped into his bones. The figure touched his face, and instantly, the world around him shattered. The snowstorm disappeared, the cemetery faded away, and Thomas found himself standing in a vast, frozen landscape. The ground beneath him was cracked and treacherous, the sky above a pale, lifeless grey. In the distance he could see a massive, towering structure, an ancient temple half buried in the snow, and standing at the entrance was a figure, taller than any human, its form cloaked in a swirling cloak of frost. The figure turned to face him, its face hidden in shadow, but Thomas could feel its gaze, like ice pricking at his skin. It spoke without words, its voice a low hum that seemed to vibrate the very air around him. "You are one of us now. Welcome to the eternal cold." Thomas's legs felt like stone, heavy and unyielding as he tried to move toward the figure. The frozen ground beneath his feet cracked with every step he took, as if the earth itself was rejecting him. The figure in the distance, still shrouded in frost, remained motionless, its presence more commanding with each passing second. As Thomas drew nearer, the air around him seemed to thicken, and an oppressive weight pressed down on his chest. When he finally reached the figure, it raised its hand, gesturing for him to stop. Thomas froze in place, his breath turning to vapor in the air. The figure slowly removed its hood, revealing a face as pale as death, its features sharp and frozen in an eternal grimace. It was the face of someone long forgotten, someone who had once been a resident of Winter's Hollow. But the eyes, those cold, hollow eyes, were unmistakable. They were the same eyes that had haunted him since the moment he unearthed the key. The same eyes that now stared at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. "You were warned," the figure whispered, its voice like the howling wind. "This place takes what it wants, the cold. It claims all who trespass. Now, you are part of it. Forever." Thomas wanted to scream, to fight back, but his body no longer obeyed him. He was no longer human, no longer alive in the way he once was. The icy touch of the figure's hand reached out once more, this time to his chest, and as it made contact, a wave of freezing darkness washed over him. His body stiffened, his breath slowing, and the ground beneath him crumbled, pulling him deeper into the frozen abyss. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the towering temple, its gates opening slowly as if welcoming him into the cold, eternal prison. The whispers of the lost souls filled his ears, their voices blending with the howling wind. "You are ours now." When Thomas awoke, he wasn't sure how much time had passed. He was no longer standing. Instead, he found himself lying on a cold, hard surface, his body stiff and immobile. The frozen wasteland was gone, replaced by a suffocating darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly around him. He could feel the weight of the cold pressing in on all sides, the very air sharp and suffocating, like 1,000 needles against his skin. His body, still frozen, ached with an intensity he couldn't describe. The whispers of the lost souls grew louder, their voices now surrounding him, their presence tangible, suffocating. "You are not alone," they murmured in unison. "The frost will keep you with us." always. Thomas tried to move, to scream, but his body betrayed him. His mouth was dry, his throat tight, and though he fought, his limbs refused to obey. It was as if the ice had claimed him completely, turning him into something less than human, less than alive. In the distance a faint glow appeared, weak and flickering, like a distant star in an eternal night. The figure, the one who had led him into this frozen nightmare, stood there, waiting. Its cold eyes met his, and this time Thomas didn't need to hear words to understand. The creature was showing him something, showing him the fate of all those who had come before him. He could see them now, the souls who had wandered too far into the cold, their bodies frozen in eternal stasis, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths frozen in silent screams. They were all part of the frost now, trapped forever in this endless winter, lost to time. The figure moved closer, its face now visible, its expression cold and empty. It gestured for Thomas to rise, and though he wanted to refuse, his body moved of its own accord. He stood, the cold biting into his bones, and as he did, he realized that he could no longer feel anything at all. No warmth, no life, only the endless, suffocating chill. "Welcome to your final resting place," the figure said, its voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Here, you will never escape. You will never feel warmth again. You are one with the frost." And as the figure stepped aside, Thomas saw the truth. The endless stretch of frozen bodies, the endless march of souls, each one claiming its place in the frost, each one lost to the winter, forever. The silence that followed was suffocating. Thomas could feel the weight of eternity pressing down on him, his very essence being absorbed by the cold, sinking deeper into the frost. The figure turned and began walking toward the glowing light in the distance, its footsteps leaving behind faint trails of frost on the ground. With no other choice, Thomas followed, his movements slow and heavy as the ice seemed to cling to him, making each step feel like an impossible burden. As they approached the light, the air grew colder still, the frost thicker, until it was as if the very fabric of space had been frozen in time. In front of them stood the towering structure Thomas had glimpsed earlier, the ancient temple, its walls covered in layers of ice that shimmered like glass. The air around it vibrated with an unnatural hum, and as they drew nearer, the temperature dropped even further, so cold that it was as if all warmth had been sucked from the world. The temple's gates, grand and imposing, creaked open, revealing the darkness inside. The figure stepped through the gates first, disappearing into the shadows. Thomas hesitated, his body numb, as he stood before the entrance. The whispers grew louder, their voices filling his mind, urging him forward. "This is where we belong. This is where you belong." The words felt like ice carving into his very soul, pushing him toward the threshold. Reluctantly, he stepped inside. The interior of the temple was vast and hollow, its walls covered in ancient runes that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was broken only by the sound of his own breath, shallow and ragged. As he ventured deeper into the temple, he saw the stone altar in the center of the room, its surface slick with frost, and standing before it, waiting for him, was the figure once more. "This is where it all ends," the figure said, its voice echoing through the chamber like a whisper carried by the wind. "This is where you will remain. Here you will be frozen forever, lost in the cold abyss." Thomas wanted to scream, to fight back, but all he could do was watch as the figure raised its hand, and the frost around him thickened, freezing his limbs, his body, until he could no longer move. He was trapped. The cold had claimed him completely. As the ice enveloped him, he saw the faces of the other lost souls, their eyes staring out from the frozen walls of the temple, their expressions frozen in terror, their mouths open in silent screams. And then, in the distance, a faint, flickering light appeared, just like the one he had seen earlier. It was the key, the very same key that had started it all. The light from the key flickered, casting eerie shadows across the ice-covered walls. Thomas's frozen gaze followed it, a fleeting, desperate hope stirring within him. But before he could react, the light dimmed, vanishing into the depths of the temple. The chill of eternity washed over him once more, and for the first time he understood. There would be no escape. He had crossed the line, ventured too far into the cold, and now he was one with the frost. just another soul lost to the endless winter. As the figure approached him once more, it placed a hand on his chest, and with a final cold whisper, it sealed his fate. Welcome to the frost. You are part of the endless cold now, where time has no place, no warmth, no escape. The figure turned, its silhouette merging with the shadows of the temple as it faded from view. Thomas's body, now entirely encased in ice, stood motionless in the heart of the temple, his once turbulent thoughts now frozen in the abyss. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him. Countless years, endless winters, and an eternity of isolation. The whispers of the lost souls still echoed in his mind, their voices now a distant hum as they too became part of the cold, bound forever to the frozen temple. The storm outside continued, snow swirling in an eternal cycle, and as the cold winds howled through the night, Winter's Hollow remained unchanged, its cemetery forgotten by the living, but its secrets preserved beneath the endless frost.